Okay, to start out, I am going to make one change to the group for our more triangular shape here. I'm just going to free transform, bring it up a little higher, go back to the perspective and pull it out. And that should be a lot better. We can move it down just a little. What I want to do with the veins is set up another mask. So within this group, I'm going to select both the veins and create another group. And set up a mask that's going to be similar to the outline. So we will need an outline shape. For that, we can go back to the backup where we have, and we should have the original layer in here. It looks like we might have not copied it. Okay, so what I can use is the mask from the left side down here. And we'll just Control A, copy, and paste. Oh, undo. Select the mask, copy, paste. And I'm going to go ahead and bring that all the way up to the top. We're going to create a duplicate, Control T, free transform, flip it horizontally and set it to lighten, and then merge it down, or select both and Control E to merge them together. Control E is also merge down. It really changes the naming of it, or how many you're merging together. And I'm going to create a quick copy of this and put it in the backup. And then Control A, copy it, and add it to the mask for veins thin. So add a mask. We could also select it and refine the edge and set it up that way. But I'm just going to go directly to that mask. And what I want to do is edit this mask, or this image. What we can do is go to Filter, Other, and select Minimum. And what this will do is cut in on the sides a bit, because what we're going to essentially be doing is blurring it. So we want to bring this in a little ways. Click OK, and then we'll blur, and we can do, we could just do a Gaussian blur. Blur Gaussian. And then after we do that, we can fine-tune it with the levels. Now we're going to go back to that mask we created, turning the layer on, and we can just use the magic wand tool, select, and I'm going to refine the edge, just smooth it a little bit. Click OK, and now go to Paths, and what we're going to do is create a new path from this selection. So we can select the marquee tool, right click, and make work path. Tolerance 2 pixels should be alright. Nope, looks like we need to go back and set that tolerance to 1 pixel. So I'm also going to set up a new layer. We're going to set to our lighter color, and we're going to now set up a paintbrush. And you can use different shape brushes depending on the look you're going for. You're going to see what we're going to do. We're going to create kind of a curvature that goes around the edge of the path. And so I do have quite a few custom brushes. But you can also use presets. You can see this kind of vertical line here. If we want to go ahead and use that, and turn off this other layer, and we can brush the path. What we'll need to do is set up the brush a little further. We'll set up scattering, and we may even need to change the direction. And then we're going to go to the brush tip shape and increase the spacing. Go to shape dynamics, and we'll have a size jitter. Very minimal angle jitter. I don't want roundness jitter, that should be okay. And we do need it to conform to the path. So there's one more setting we'll need to do. We'll set the angle jitter to direction. A little bit too much. And we shouldn't even need to jitter it at all. As long as it's set to direction, it should apply. So we'll go ahead and brush it. And that worked out pretty well. I think I want a little more variation. I'm going to go to the shape and change the diameter down just a little. Shape dynamics. Try to get this to scatter a little bit more, and then change the diameter down further. And it's looking pretty good. And decrease the spacing. And that should be good. So that way we've got this nice edge around this that we can use to add a little bit more detail. So let's go ahead and bring this to a lower layer. Actually, just above that outside gradient we did for the veins. So we can get rid of the fill. And I'm going to deselect that work path so it's not showing up. And then through here we can set up a color overlay. It's just easier to work with the style, because there's a lot more choices we can use. An outer glow, precise. We'll set our size to 2. And just bring the opacity down just a little. We'll set it to color burn, maybe. Take a look. Yeah, color burn. It's going to give us a nice saturation along with that. We'll do a little bit of inner shadow. Get rid of the distance. Set the size to 2, maybe 3. And then just adjust the contour if needed. Anti-aliased. And then we can just adjust the opacity. And then we'll just bring that in a little bit. And we could also adjust the levels of this in order to modify the style. But because there's probably not enough information in there, it's a pretty hard brush I was using, there's not a whole lot of variance. So what I can also do is take this layer, create a duplicate, and just set up a blur. And what we're going to use is a radial blur. Set to zoom, set it to best. An amount of 10 should be alright. And we'll apply it again. A couple more times. So now I'm just going to modify the outer glow. And go to the color overlay and make it a little bit of a different color. And more towards the background color that we've got. And then if we need to shift it just a little, we can free transform that layer and just size it out just a little. And we'll go ahead and create a new group from these. Now, before we go ahead and merge everything together, I want to set up multiple maps. So what we can do is basically duplicate under the history panel, just create a new document from the current state, so that we have one we can work with for creating the bump, or one for the highlight, backlight, any different maps you want to create. I think I'm mostly going to be just modifying bump or highlight, just using one or the other. Sometimes we could use both. And then having one document for the color. And then once we create our group of those, we can create a layer set that we can kind of copy over in order to create a 3-leaf setup. So let's start with the bump, and what I'm going to do is remove that variation in the center, because that's really not going to be a part of the bump. We also don't want to use those fringe areas on the side. And when we go down to the bottom in these main sections, those individual lines really don't need to be used for the bump either. So what we're going to do instead is set up a layer style. We'll just do a gradient overlay. And we're just reversing it, angle at 0, scale at 93, and then I'm also going to go into the gradient and just adjust the shape a little bit. So we can copy this layer style and paste it on the one below. And we don't need to have the layer behind that. And some of these different styles or blending features we can get rid of. I am going to need to go into that other gradient and turn off the reverse. We can also adjust the scale a little bit to add an amount of variation so it's not perfect on both sides. That'll really help pick up highlights within the map. Okay, so our veins, we're going to take a look, and want to make sure that that top vein is at 100%. We can turn off the drop shadow. We'll take our color overlay and set it to 100%. Make sure our fill is turned up all the way. Go into the color and desaturate it. And just desaturate all the colors that are influencing this. So the fill is also green, so we will need to adjust that. And then we're going to go into the veins. And let's set the opacity amounts to 100%. Make sure the top levels are also at 100. And then we're going to set the color overlay to be desaturated. And let's go ahead and bring that down. And then we're just going to need to adjust the style to get it to mix in better. So we'll use pin light. And then we can copy it and paste it onto the other one. And then the veins, now we can adjust that so it's not so intense. So let's go ahead and set that to 20% for both of them. We can also set up a little bit of a drop shadow, setting it to black. No distance, change that size down. And then we'll just copy the layer style and paste it to the other one. Now we do need it to mix more with the current setup. So we may need to adjust our blending mode. And I set it to overlay, and with that overlay setting, it does look best, but I will need to adjust the underneath layers a little. So 50% for the opacity. Let's go and take a look at the color overlay, and maybe we'll just increase the height of it. So we'll go ahead and stick with this as our base. First, just copying over this new layer style. And then what we can do is I am going to save this as a separate file just in case. And then go ahead and I can just flatten it. Actually, taking a look, I just want to see if I can extend the range maybe a little, but that is part of the other layer. That should be okay. So we'll flatten it, and then I'm just going to set up levels a little bit. And then add just a gradient to it. So make it a layer, add a gradient. We'll use hard light. And that should be good. We'll flatten it again. Go ahead and save it. And then we'll go over to the color. And just gonna modify that center section, just the mask, and paint in black. Alright, we'll need to change my brush. And just remove the edge and make it a little easier and less cleanup later. Okay, so we'll save this as 7 color. And we want to keep this original mask. And then we can merge everything else down. Depending on the amount of changes you want to make to this center section here, you could merge everything except that. But changing that stem could be an issue in that case. But I think we will keep it separate. So everything except these top couple layers we're going to just merge. And now we want to increase the canvas size. And let's go ahead and put it at 1280 by 1280. And I'm just going to grab a sample of that background color that was set up, or that is currently there, create a new layer and just fill it in. Now we're going to need to make sure that these are grouped, except for that bottom layer. I'm going to pull that out. And I'm going to take this top layer, that's basically our mask, and I'm going to set color to black and fill it in around the edges. And just zoom in a bit and make sure there's no pixel blending that's strange at all. It looks like that should be good. So now we're going to Control A and copy. So Control A, select all, Control C to copy, and we're going to add a mask. Paste that in. And now this is our group. And we can go ahead and duplicate it. So I'm also going to rename this leaf top, create a duplicate, and leaf right, and then make one leaf left. So we're going to free transform, and we want to rotate it 120 degrees. And for this one, we go negative 120. And for this one, 120. Apply the transformation and just line that up. So now if we want to make changes to that center section, and we can then make it look different than the other ones. Just clone stamp, and fill it in some areas, and go to the mask. We could also use the brush tool and paint onto the mask. I'm going to go ahead and edit this brush. Remove spacing, add a little scattering, which it will increase spacing just a little. That should be alright. And we'll go ahead and just change the opacity down. And then we're going to go through the other ones. And just vary it. And back up to the top. and change that one as well. Now we can also adjust the position of it a little. So we're going to select that group. We can free transform it, and we can distort. Just so that it's not perfect. And then we could go to the other one as well, the leaf right. Select that group, free transform, and this time I'll scale it a little. We could even rotate it a little bit. Maybe squish it down. And that way it's got more variation than it did before. We could also go to the individual layer mask and distort that. And that can create some of the best variations you'll get because of the separate masking that is applied. And we could even warp it. And funny enough, I did just realize that I forgot to bring over the bump. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that bump, and which means I'll also have to transform them and match them up. So we'll create a couple of copies, one for each. This was something that was supposed to be done earlier before transforming, which was the whole point of making a separate document, so that it all lined up. So what I'm going to need to do is just match the position for each one. And this is going to go in the leaf top. And set it to normal for now. And we can turn it off because it doesn't need to be on. So then we also need the other ones to be rotated 120 degrees. So this is our leaf right. And we'll go ahead and set that to difference so that we can see where it lines up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for the other one too, and then just add it to the layer. So now all of those are in the layers, so when I need them I can turn them on and save out the map for the bump. Basically, I think we're going to stick with everything we've got here. Maybe add a connector for the stem, but I'll do that after everything's kind of merged together. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save another copy of this, and then we're going to merge everything together. So we can merge group on each one of these. Oh, actually, I'm gonna have to go back because of the bump maps. Did forget about those. So merge everything except the bump map. Okay, so now we have individual layers for each color, and then also the bump when we decide to extract that. I am going to go ahead and crop. just so we don't have too much canvas space, although I do want to make sure that we do have that point in the center. So we'll need to be a little off. We could also rotate it sideways, which might help keep us in center. And we'll do 30 degrees. And that's really not going to be that much different. We'll just go ahead and keep it the way it's at. If we need to make any additional changes, it's not going to be difficult. Let's just try to keep that mostly in the center. We can always change, of course, the hooking point in view. And if it is a little off-center, it's going to add more variation to the shaping of the leaves, which is going to end up looking better. So one thing I want to do is set up one additional layer style for the leaf edge. We're going to set it to an inner glow. And be able to see that showing. And we will need to move, I think, the mask over. So we'll just duplicate this really quick and throw the mask on there. Delete that duplicate group and just do the same thing for all of them. And I'll do it to the last one too. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and set up that inner glow. And we're going to set this to soft light. Yeah, soft light looks good. And if we need to modify that color a little bit, red 218, green 255, and blue 190. It might be a little too intense. Can adjust our range, because we just want to have that little bit of highlight right on the edge. Okay, so we'll go ahead and copy the layer style and then paste it onto the other ones. And you could add a bit of variability to it as well. So we can go to 1 and maybe lower that a little. Go to another one. Increase it maybe. And now I'm going to set the background to be as close as possible to the edge. So I'm going to create just take a sample. We'll set it to a point sample. And just grab, actually, maybe we'll do a 3x3 and just get in here to the edge. And then fill that layer with that color. I'm getting it as close as possible. We can adjust the alpha so that it just cuts in a little bit more, and that won't really be a problem. So setting up color variation can be done after the maps themselves are compressed and kind of put together. So for now, what I'm going to do is create a duplicate of this document, and this one is going to be for the bump. And we're going to do the same thing, or at least attempt to, for this background layer. So what we can do is set up a gradient overlay, set it to radial, and just increase the size. And just right now, I'm just trying to get the top portion to match or get as close as possible. And once that's closer, we can go into the gradient itself and grab that color and then grab a sample of the center and maybe lighten it up. And this is really just to improve any MIP mapping. So that is basically the initial bump. I still don't have the stem for the center. You may not even see it, but I'll just clone stamp that in. That'll be really easy. So what I can do is just flatten this. And I will just go in, clone stamp tool. Go ahead and set this just to a softer brush, but increase the hardness. Change diameter. I'm working with a pretty small layer here, or a pretty small brush. Just kind of get those to meet in the center. Doesn't have to be perfect because it's hardly going to be seen. That should be good. Okay, so there's the bump. And close out that individual one. And then I'm going to go ahead and save my copy of this and create another duplicate. This one is going to be, I want to have the masks set up, so we are going to have to extract the masks. And paste them in. And because they should match the document size, it should be really easy just to do a lighten blend. So I'll go into each individual mask, Control A, copy, Control V to paste. Set it to lighten. The next one to lighten. And we can merge them. I'm going to bring back my navigator. Can't really see where the stem comes out on this. So what I can do is just copy and paste the bump in here. This is also a good way to make sure that everything is matching. Okay, so I'm going to take the bump and just, for now, change the opacity. And just use a brush, white, just a hard brush. Change that diameter. Set that opacity higher. And probably have to make an even smaller brush. What I'm also going to do is go to the brush tip shape and get rid of the spacing. And that way we should have a harder edge. Just kind of join those. Turn off the bump. I'm going to fill it in. If it gets too small and there's too many small pixels, I just fill them in. This alpha, we need to make view compatible. So a matter of getting just a black and white. So what we can do is flatten, mode, grayscale, change to 8-bit, switch it to a bitmap, and I'm going to switch it back to grayscale, and that alpha should be good to go. So what I'll do is just copy this, paste it on here. I'm going to end up saving these out separately because Vue doesn't support multi-layered TIFF files. If I was to bring this into, say, Cinema 4D or something, I could just have one individual file for everything. It does make it a lot easier. But Vue does not have that capability yet. So now we also have our color we could save out. For this, what I'm going to actually do is create another duplicate and flatten it. And then I'm going to go into the center there and just clone stamp the stem. That should be fine. Okay, so I'll just copy this and paste it into this layer. So now we have the color, the alpha, and our bump. So we can close out these additional versions. I do have this one saved, so I can always go back. But now I'm going to save out the individual files for this. And like I said, we can do color variations from this color map now. So if we wanted to, it would make any sort of adjustments. We could just edit this individual map. We could set up masks to modify the blending between a couple of different versions in order to get different lighting styles. We could change the exposure settings and gamma, and then mix and blend those. Different things we can do, but for now, let's just go ahead and get it over into Vue and take a look at setting it up. So what I'm going to do is save this, and I'm going to save this to the same directory I've been using for the rest of the training that's within the Vue content folder. So we're going to call this Clover Color. I also want to mention, I am saving this, I want to turn off the layers, save it as a copy. This is a 16-bit file, and I know that in some cases for Mac users, you may need to use a different format. I'm going to turn off the compression for this layer. So one thing to keep in mind is if 16-bit TIFF isn't working, try a different format. I know that there are some issues with Mac. At least I've had a couple of clients opening some of my TIFF files that were 16-bit and them not working. So then having to use different formats. PNG works pretty well. You can always go to EXR if needed. Of course, that's 32-bit. And extra information that may not be needed. So now I'm going to save. Actually, this one does not need to be 16-bit, and actually with an alpha, especially a PNG, Vue is not compatible with a 16-bit alpha channel. So really important to make sure that your alpha channels are either bitmap mode or 8-bit. So we'll just save that one as an 8-bit file, Clover alpha. So if you have a 16-bit file with an embedded alpha, it may or may not work correctly. So it's a good idea just to have a separate version. An LZW compression. And let's go ahead and save out the bump. And turn off layers. Okay, so there we go. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save this for my layered setup, in case I want to use it in another program. And we can close out this other layer, and this one's already saved. So let's go into View and create our Clover species. Okay, so in View, what we're going to do is load in a plant, and under Grasses and Plants, we're going to load in the small grass field plant. This is going to work pretty well for this. For the most part, it's simplistic. It's a leaf poly, a set of leaf polys on top of a stem. So that's going to work really well for a clover. This one's designed where by default uses one individual leaf, a reniform leaf. But it should work well with the trifoliate, which is clover, and the 3 set of leaves. So we're going to edit the object and go into the different leaves. Now this does have a setup for multiple leaves. First, I'm just going to create one and copy and paste it to the other ones, and then we can, if needed, go back to Photoshop and modify different color variations, or we can set up color variations within View. I'm going to edit the leaf. I'm going to load in my images. So go to the vegetation, and we can see those new maps in there. I'm going to grab the clover color and the alpha. I have to invert the alpha. And go ahead and select that hooking point. Click OK. And then we're going to edit the material. Go into the bump channel, and we can edit that. And there's a texture map in there. We'll go ahead and load in the one we just created. And set the interpolation type to bilinear, which is already set up that way. Bumps and highlights, anytime you're modifying a bump or a highlight channel, you want to have bilinear on if you're using an image map. For the color and the alpha or the transparency, you do not need to have an interpolation type, and actually using an interpolation type on the transparency channel, unless you have really, really small details, it's usually a bad idea. And we'll go ahead and set that bump up to 0.2, and we'll see how that looks. I'm going to copy the material and then paste it onto the other subsets. So we want a little variation so we can adjust the flexibility, and actually I'll go ahead and do this on all subsets. And there we go. So let's take a look and see how that turned out. Looks like maybe the hooking points aren't working correctly for some of them. So I'm going to regrow it and just check and make sure. It looks like that's alright. It might just be an OpenGL thing. So let's see how the bump looks, and then whether or not we need to change anything else. I think I am going to modify the bump going into the function, and what I'm going to do is offset the function so that we're going entirely in one direction. So we're going to add the offset filter, connect that to our texture map, and then connect the bump and then the displacement outputs to that offset. So when we offset in a specific direction, we're controlling the bump. As long as we're below 0 or above 0, the bump is going entirely in one direction. So there's no in and out variation. That can be pretty helpful for putting texture maps on leaves, and we'll go ahead and try something reversed. Try -0.2. And that works pretty well. So now I want to modify the highlight. One thing we could do is set variable highlights, and then we can connect that to the grayscale output of the projected texture map for the bump. And those two will work very nicely together. Might need to increase the contrast or even invert it. And so we can go to the intensity filter, we could just kind of swap that. And now we have an inverse highlight. It looks pretty good. Might want to change leaf variations a little, but for the most part, it should be okay. It looks like that center stem is really more intense than I did intend for the bump. So I think what I'm going to do is just go and change that center point. So in Photoshop, I have this opened, the bump. I'm going to add, just duplicate the layer and go into the filter and select Blur Surface Blur. Okay, so I have the radius at 16 and threshold at 53. So obviously we lose certain details that will have to be blended back in. But what we're going to do is mix these together to still pull out those nice details on the sides, and we just really want to take care of that center point, because the problem is it falls off to black or too dark around the edges because of the inner shadow that was used, and I should have reduced that intensity earlier. Just using a normal blending mode, I'm going to set the opacity to 90. You can go ahead and merge it down. And I'm going to save this as a new bump, because I don't want to overwrite the other file. And we'll go ahead and see if that's going to work. If not, we'll have to maybe vary it, clean it up a little bit more. Even maybe go back to that other stem, because it really wasn't that difficult to set up the bump alignment. So we'll go edit the material, select the bump channel, and the image, and load bump 2 in. And let's go ahead and see how that's going to turn out. And it's a little better. But I'm not going to spend too much time cleaning it up. I think for the moment I'm just going to go back to that previous version and reduce the bump output. Let's use 0.05. And that should work pretty well. With the most intensity on the highlight, or using more intensity on the highlight, we'll be able to pull out more of the leaf variations. So if we go into that highlight connection, I am going to add a filter and go to brightness and contrast. Let's set the contrast to 2, brightness to 0. And actually that does work much better. I was talking earlier while designing the maps about the way the highlight and the bump will work. So now you can kind of see exactly how that kind of plays out. and I may need to go in and adjust some of the leaf settings a little bit. I think one of the problems with the hooking points is just that we haven't set them individually, because there are some that are off. But for the most part it looks okay. For the highlight, I'm going to make a couple of changes, increase the brightness, and then change the highlight color to be the ambient light color from the light editor, which I have saved in my color palette. We could also take a look at a reverse highlight and go ahead and switch that back and see how that's going to look. It might work out a little bit better. And I think the picking up on the edge there does look a lot better. So I'm just going to turn down the overall brightness, reduce the contrast a bit in the effects tab, and I think we've covered enough for you to be able to understand how to change different color variations and make alternate maps to fill in the other presets. We've spent quite a bit of time working on this one plant, but hopefully you've learned quite a bit of what you can do in Photoshop to create a custom leaf. It is kind of nice sometimes being able to just create something from scratch without using an image reference. So I'm going to save the species out and we'll just take a look at it in an ecosystem. So just going back to the first ecosystem that I created with grass variations from earlier, I'm going to add in new plant and select the clovers. Okay, so I'm just going to increase the presence so there's a lot more clovers than the other grass. Change our scaling variation so we can see a little better on what will happen with scale change. And I'm not too big on the specular setup now that I'm looking at it. One thing we can do to make it look better is we're going to edit the material. We're going to go to that highlight, and we're going to take and make a copy of the color map, set the interpolation type to bilinear, and we're going to add a blender to the grayscale output, and we're going to multiply. And I'm going to switch over my preview options to the 2D plane so I can actually see what's happening. Maybe we'll set it to subtract. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is blend at 0.5. Maybe take down the contrast or the brightness. That might work a little bit better. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the new highlight setting. And that looks a million times better. That's much more realistic. So I'm just going to do one last population without the grass in it. And then we can see just the clovers. Go ahead and increase density. And we'll see lots of clovers. And let's also set it up so that we have backlight showing. And so I could also just move the sun around. Let's just take a look from here. Maybe we'll zoom in so we get some foreground clovers that are a little larger, and then we can check out the ones that are farther away. And I'm very satisfied with the way that that came out. The lighting, I think, looks really good. Good balance overall. Besides the obvious need for a color variation with more of a blue variation and some lighter green variations, which can be easily set up, I think that looks pretty good. The shadows from the sunlight are a little dark, but that's just a overall scene lighting setting. You just turn that down. So I think that turned out pretty good. One last highlight technique that you can do, which is actually really useful, same thing with the bump too, is to have each leaf at a different elevation or a different output. So what you could do is just go back to the map and use some color overlays, or even use the alpha and just set them at different overall heights and mix it together, and that will offset each individual leaf, so to make them look like they're overlapping, and that'll add even more detail and variation and make it look a lot better. Lots of ways could, of course, improve it, and it really depends on how close you're going to be to the objects and whether or not you really need all that detail. This I did want to have a nice clover plant for a close-up. Very versatile, and something that would also work good for large-scale ecosystems without tying up too many resources. So I think it succeeded pretty well. And besides maybe setting the backlight color, which I did not do, I'd say we're pretty much finished.